Okay, so the next couple of videos are going to be about the development of fetal systems. So the embryo becomes a fetus around 9 weeks after fertilization. When we talk about fetal viability, that's a term you're going to hear when we talk about the fetus. Fetal viability is the ability to survive outside the uterus. And that's around somewhere around 22 to 25 weeks gestation. And that survival is going to require really advanced care. So that's not, everything's probably going to be okay. That's some really challenging, high mortality care. But at 22 weeks is probably about the earliest. And what mostly determines that is whether that fetus has developed enough alveoli to exchange gases, because after birth, we don't really get a lot more alveoli development. So we're going to get to that piece in a minute. We're going to start with development of the circulatory system. By the third week, there's a primitive heart. Around week 4 or 5, the heart has developed 4 chambers. When heart development is complete, then this is what fetal circulation looks like. There are 3 temporary bypasses in circulation. There's a ductus venosus, a ductus arteriosus, and a foramen ovale. Okay. To understand this, you have to begin by understanding adult circulation. So from the right atrium, where does blood go? It goes to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, where does blood go? It goes through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, where it is oxygenated. From the lungs, it goes back through the pulmonary veins to the left ventricle, left atrium. From the left atrium, it goes to the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, it goes out to the systemic circulation, returns by the veins, and eventually the vena cava empty back into the right atrium. So I want to walk through that first so that you understand that circulation, okay? In fetal circulation, we add an umbilical cord and a placenta, and we have 3 actual bypasses because blood does not need to go to the lungs to be oxygenated, okay? So we have ductus venosus, ductus arteriosus, foramen ovale. All right, so oxygenated blood flows in from the placenta through the umbilical vein into the fetal abdomen. It divides at the liver. So we have some blood that goes through the liver, but from that arterial vascular, or from that liver vascular system, there's actually a duct between that and the vena cava. So most of it goes through the ductus venosus into the inferior vena cava. Okay, so we get a little bit to the liver. Most of it goes through the ductus venosus, goes to the inferior vena cava. Okay, this oxygenated blood in the inferior vena cava actually mixes with deoxygenated blood coming back from the legs and the lower body. So the legs and the abdomen, the deoxygenated blood goes into the inferior vena cava. We shunt some of that oxygenated blood, most of that oxygenated blood, some goes to the liver, the rest shunts over into the inferior vena cava. Inferior vena cava goes to the right atrium. Okay, now the right atrium, some of that blood is going to go to the right ventricle. Most of that blood is going to go through an opening between the atria called the foramen ovale. So there's an opening from the right atrium to the left atrium called the foramen ovale. Now there's a reason that most of the blood doesn't go forward to the right ventricle. We have the hole, but when you think about how water works, how fluid works, it's going to take the path of least resistance. So what causes the right ventricle and the lungs to be the path of greater resistance? The lungs are not inflated, okay, and the pulmonary vessels are really constricted. So the pulmonary arteries are constricted. So there's a lot of pressure. So a little bit of blood goes into the right ventricle and into the pulmonary arteries, but most of it goes over into that left atrium, or a good part of it goes into that left atrium through the foramen ovale. Now, let's stick with the blood that goes into the right ventricle. It goes into the pulmonary artery. And again, there's another opening. There's an opening called the ductus arteriosus between the pulmonary artery and the aorta. Okay. The pressure is still high in the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary vascular system. And so even more of that blood shunts over into the aorta. Okay. So just a tiny amount of blood actually goes through the vessels that go to the lungs and come back. So that goes through the lungs, come back to the aorta. The blood from the right ventricle goes through the the right atrium goes through the foraminal valve to the left atrium. That blood goes to the left ventricle and then out through the aorta. The blood that gets into the right ventricle goes into the pulmonary artery, and a lot of that blood also goes into the aorta. So now we have blood from 3 different sources in the aorta. One thing that you need to know is that ductus arteriosus is past the arteries that supply the upper body. So the most oxygenated blood is going to go to the top part of the body. Okay. Deoxygenated blood travels through the aorta to the internal iliac arteries, to the umbilical arteries, through the fetal abdomen and legs, and then it goes back through the umbilical arteries to the placenta. Okay, so that's actually the circulation of the blood. Now, fetal oxygen saturation is lower than adult oxygen saturation. Fetal hemoglobin carries more oxygen, and the fetus has more hemoglobin. So that oxygen transfer to fetal tissues is easier and occurs at a lower oxygen concentration. Blood cells begin to be formed in the yolk sac at about week 3. Hematopoiesis begins in the liver about week 6. This is connected to the cardiovascular system because we've got to have some red blood cells to carry that oxygen. Stem cells see the bone marrow, the spleen, thymus, lymph nodes between weeks 8 and 11, and then the bone marrow begins to form blood cells. The antigenic factors that determine blood type are present from about week 6. From about week 6 on, the fetus is beginning to make blood, and that blood has a different blood type from the mother. Okay, we're going to stop here because this is a lot, and we're going to come back and talk about the respiratory system in the next video.